I remember the sky turning black over Texas on what had begun as a bright summer afternoon. The sun vanished behind a boiling cloud of ash rolling in from the northwest. Within hours, a fine grey powder began to rain down, dusting the streets and turning midday into midnight. We stood under that ashen sky, terrified and confused, as the news finally broke. Yellowstone had erupted in a cataclysmic supereruption. The ground trembled even 1,000 miles away. I watched vehicles skidding in panic and people staring skyward in disbelief as the realization set in. An unprecedented disaster was unfolding across the nation. At Ground Zero in Wyoming, the eruption exploded with the force of hundreds of atomic bombs. A colossal plume of ash and pumice rocketed upward at supersonic speeds, reaching the edge of space within minutes. Day turned to night across the Yellowstone region as the sky filled with black volcanic debris. The initial blast was so powerful it tore magma apart into a towering mushroom cloud, its roar heard hundreds of miles away. Moments later, the eruption column collapsed under its own weight, unleashing pyroclastic flows. Fast-moving avalanches of superheated gas, ash and rock, racing outward at over 300 kilometers per hour. Everything within roughly a 100-kilometer radius was obliterated. In those first terrifying moments, every living thing around Yellowstone was incinerated. Forests were reduced to charcoal, and towns across parts of Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho were engulfed in a flood of burning ash with no chance of escape. Thousands of people simply vanished in the pyroclastic inferno, leaving behind nothing but scorched earth. Even beyond this kill zone, the supervolcano's effects were catastrophic. As many as 90,000 people could be killed almost instantly by the blast and suffocating ash in the initial hours. In the days that followed, the disaster escalated. Volcanic ash was ejected high into the stratosphere and began falling across a massive swath of the country. Areas closest to Yellowstone were buried under several meters of molten ash, entombing roads, farms, and homes. Entire counties in the Rocky Mountain region vanished under thick layers of sludge-like debris. Farther out, cities hundreds of miles away faced their own disasters. Within 24 hours, ash was falling across most of the United States and parts of Canada. Even distant cities like Chicago and San Francisco received up to 3 centimeters of ashfall, enough to cripple infrastructure. Major metros like Denver and Salt Lake City were buried under tens of centimeters to several feet of ash. Even New York and Miami, though far from the blast, saw a thin film of volcanic dust settle, just a few millimeters thick, but enough to mark the scope of the catastrophe. It was as if the entire continent had been blanketed in grey snow. The weight of ash caused hundreds of buildings to collapse, especially flat-roofed structures that couldn't bear the unexpected load. Throughout the Midwest and West, rooftops caved in, trapping and killing those who had sought shelter indoors. Power lines snapped and transformers shorted out as fine ash infiltrated the electrical grid. Nationwide blackouts followed as wet ash caused line shorts and power plants shut down due to clogged air intakes. Water treatment and sewer systems failed as ash turned to cement-like sludge in the pipes. Transportation came to a standstill. Highways became impassable and visibility dropped to near zero in many areas. Air travel was completely halted, not just in the US but globally, because the ash plume made flying too dangerous, a hard-learned lesson after a much smaller Icelandic eruption grounded European flights in 2010. The United States was effectively carved into isolated pockets of chaos. Amid the regional destruction, tens of millions faced displacement. Those who survived in the worst-hit states found their homes and towns uninhabitable, buried under toxic ash and cut off from water and power. Millions of Americans became refugees, fleeing eastward and southward by any means available in search of clean air and basic shelter. Highways out of the Rocky Mountain states clogged with cars and trucks until ash rendered them useless, forcing many to continue on foot. The US government and military scrambled to respond, but the scale of the calamity was overwhelming. Federal Emergency Services, FEMA, mobilized across the country, yet entire regions were cut off, with highways and airports unusable. National Guard units were deployed in dozens of states to assist with evacuations and to prevent looting and violence amid the desperation. In many areas, martial law was declared as civil authority broke down. a necessary step when communications were lost and local governments became paralyzed. Emergency shelters and refugee camps sprang up in states like Texas, Oklahoma, and farther east, where ashfall was lighter, but they quickly overflowed with evacuees. I remember arriving at one such shelter outside Houston, my clothes still dusty and my lungs raw from ash, only to find thousands of others packed into tents and gymnasiums, the faces of children streaked with tears and grime. The federal government relocated operations to emergency bunkers and backup facilities. In Washington, D.C., the sky was hazy, but the machinery of command kept running on generators and satellite phones. Even as leaders tried to organize relief, rumors swirled of last-ditch contingency plans. One apocryphal story claimed that officials had long feared such a scenario, and had even approached foreign allies like South Africa to host displaced Americans, expecting millions might need refuge abroad. Whether true or not, such tales underscored the sheer magnitude of the human displacement the country was facing. On the ground, society in the American West had fully collapsed. Normal life came to a standstill everywhere the ash fell. With power grids down, communications were spotty or non-existent. Many regions became information black holes, cut off for days or even weeks. Emergency services were so overwhelmed that fires burned unchecked in some ash-choked cities, their orange glow reflecting eerily off the constant fallout of grey dust. Hospitals overflowed with the injured and those struggling to breathe. Volcanic ash is essentially made of microscopic shards of glass, and inhaling it led to countless cases of lung damage. When the heavy ash mixed with rain, it formed concrete-like sludge that collapsed roofs and turned roads into rivers of mud. Water supplies were poisoned as ash carried toxic metals like arsenic and lead into reservoirs. Farm animals died by the millions, either buried in ash or poisoned by it, and crops across the Great Plains and Midwest were flattened and contaminated. In a matter of days, the United States breadbasket was effectively destroyed. The economic damage was staggering, trillions of dollars lost as factories, power plants, and infrastructure were buried under ash. Even the nation's military, often the backbone of disaster response, struggled. Bases in the western states became inoperable, their runways coated in ash, with many soldiers among the victims. Yet amidst the chaos, they worked heroically. I recall seeing a convoy of army trucks roll into our area of refuge, soldiers handing out water and face masks to the haggard survivors. This was America's darkest hour, a time of mass death, mass displacement, and near-total breakdown of infrastructure. The supereruption had effectively decapitated the country's heartland, and its ripple effects were only just beginning. Around the globe, the sky itself began to testify to Yellowstone's fury. In the weeks following the eruption, distant sunsets turned bizarrely vivid, blood red and purple, as high-altitude ash spread across the world. I woke one morning in a hazy gloom, hundreds of miles from the eruption, to find the sun reduced to a weak orange disk behind a veil of ash. It was the middle of summer, yet a chill hung in the air, far sharper than any July should feel. I remember stepping outside at noon and seeing my breath, the heat of the season gone, as if nature's thermostat had been abruptly turned down. Reports poured in from across the planet. Europe was seeing eerie fogs and frosts in high summer. The Asian monsoon rains were failing, and in Africa, the usually brilliant equatorial sky had faded to a washed-out white. The entire world now lived under a parasol of ash and gas that blotted out the sun. It was as if a dim twilight had settled over Earth, an endless dusk casting long shadows even at midday. We all shared the same fearful thought. A global winter was coming, born not of ice and snow, but of ash and darkness. Scientifically, what was happening to the atmosphere was expected, but terrifying in scale. Yellowstone's eruption had injected an enormous volume of ash and sulfur gases into the stratosphere, far above the clouds where no rain could wash them out quickly. In that high, thin air, the volcanic sulfur dioxide began reacting with water vapor to form a mist of sulfuric acid droplets. This hazy aerosol spread worldwide within weeks, encircling the globe and forming a veil that reflected sunlight back into space. While the immediate ashfall that caused so much havoc on the ground began to settle, the remaining dust and gases aloft created a global sunshade. Scientists warned that we were entering a volcanic winter, The same phenomenon observed on a smaller scale after historic eruptions. For example, the 1991 eruption of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines cooled the planet by about 0.5 degrees Celsius for a couple of years. But Yellowstone's blast was hundreds of times larger, a true VEI-8 supereruption, and its climatic impact was projected to be far more profound. Climate models soon predicted that average global temperatures would plummet by as much as 4 degrees Celsius. Over land masses, especially in the northern hemisphere, the drop could be even steeper. In effect, Yellowstone was undoing decades of global warming in a matter of months, hurtling the climate back toward Little Ice Age conditions, or worse. Glaciers worldwide began to advance as cooler temperatures and reduced sunlight tipped the balance. In the first year after the eruption, snow fell in summertime at higher latitudes, and freak frosts struck tropical highlands that had never felt a chill. The term volcanic winter was no longer theoretical. It had become a reality, draping the Earth in cold and darkness for months on end. The atmospheric dust and aerosols didn't just cool the world, they distorted weather patterns. Normal climate cycles were thrown into disarray. The Asian monsoon weakened drastically, leaving millions of farmers without life-giving rains. Persistent droughts struck parts of Africa and Australia as rainfall patterns shifted unpredictably. Elsewhere, typically arid areas suffered torrential downpours as the altered atmosphere triggered chaotic swings in precipitation. No corner of the globe was truly spared. If one region wasn't buried in ash, it was facing crop-killing cold or destructive storms. Scientists compared the event to past calamities like the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora, which caused the infamous Year Without a Summer in 1816. After Tambora, temperatures in Europe dropped and crops failed, leading to famine and riots. But Yellowstone's eruption was on a scale perhaps 25 times greater than Tambora's, promising an even more dire aftermath. Researchers warned that the cooling from Yellowstone could rival the onset of an ice age, at least temporarily. They estimated it could take a decade or more for global temperatures to recover, even as the aerosol veil slowly settled out of the sky. In the meantime, the world's food supply was in serious jeopardy. As the volcanic winter tightened its grip, the true scale of humanity's plight came into focus. The first and most urgent crisis was food. In the United States, the destruction of the Midwest breadbasket had already sent shockwaves through supply chains. Now, worldwide crop failures began to compound the disaster. Europe's wheat and corn fields, stunted by cold and lack of sunlight, yielded almost nothing. In Asia, the disruption of monsoon rains meant rice harvests failed from India to China. Even in the southern hemisphere, where the seasons were reversed, the following summer came late and cold. Globally, stores of grain and canned food became precious lifelines. Exporting nations halted shipments. Countries began hoarding food, knowing that mass famine was looming. I remember the ration lines forming by that fall. In my city, supermarkets were emptied within hours after the eruption, and they stayed empty. Within weeks, the government introduced ration cards, and each family was issued strictly measured provisions. Even with rationing, supplies dwindled. I stood for hours in a queue outside a relief center, stomach hollow with hunger, waiting for a single bag of rice and a few bottles of water. Around me, once orderly neighbors were growing desperate. I saw fistfights break out over a sack of flour. One evening, the delivery truck never arrived at our center, and a restless crowd turned into an angry mob. I'll never forget the scene. Hungry families breaking into a storage depot, soldiers shouting for order, and then the crack of gunshots above our heads. Riots erupted in cities across the world with similar fury, as starving populations demanded food that simply didn't exist. The thin veneer of civilization was beginning to crumble under the weight of starvation and fear. Financial systems were another casualty. Global economic panic set in immediately after the eruption. Stock markets crashed as investors realized that production and trade would be paralyzed for years. In the following months, currencies became volatile or collapsed outright, especially in import-dependent countries. The price of food commodities skyrocketed to levels never seen before. For those with money, it hardly mattered. Store shelves were bare. Oil and energy prices also spiked, then plummeted as the world economy ground to a halt. Fuel was useless when there was nothing to transport and no one able to work. Unemployment soared worldwide. Factories lacked raw materials, and employees either stayed home to care for their families or simply had no jobs to return to. International trade largely ceased. Ports were either buried under ash or receiving no cargo. The concept of a globalized economy unraveled, replaced by local survivalism. Some nations tried to organize food-sharing alliances or emergency relief convoys for harder-hit regions, but these efforts were hampered by the same problems everywhere. No region had much food to spare, and transportation was crippled by climate and chaos. The world's telecommunications and internet infrastructure, though not physically destroyed, suffered from constant power outages and a lack of human personnel. As a result, news became scarce and often outdated. A kind of eerie silence fell over the once constant global chatter of the 21st century, replaced by the urgent local concerns of mere survival. Politically and socially, the supereruption proved destabilizing on a scale rivaling world wars. In many countries, governments struggled to maintain control as citizens, hungry and afraid, lost faith in their leaders. Geopolitical tensions flared dangerously. Nations with strategic grain reserves or remaining arable land came under immense pressure, both internal and external. For example, Russia and Canada, with their vast land and resources, suddenly found other countries clamoring for access to food or farmland, by diplomacy or by force. In the Middle East and North Africa, where food imports were crucial, the absence of shipments led to state failures and mass migration. Millions of refugees from famine-stricken parts of Africa and Asia began moving toward any place rumored to have food, sometimes embarking on perilous sea journeys in flotillas of overcrowded boats. International conflict over resources became a grim reality. Water, always a source of tension, grew even scarcer in the altered climate. Disputes over rivers and reservoirs ignited between countries that once cooperated. Some governments, in desperate attempts to secure food for their people, resorted to military action. Isolated skirmishes broke out near borders and around grain warehouses. The United Nations attempted to coordinate a global response, launching what it called a volcanic winter relief plan, but it was largely ineffective beyond paper resolutions. The usual apparatus of international aid was simply overwhelmed. There was no unaffected donor nation left to rally the others. Within nations, civil unrest and violence became commonplace. In Europe and North America, regions that once prided themselves on stability, martial law and curfews became the norm as authorities tried to quell food riots and looting. Democratic institutions were put on hold, elections were postponed, and civil liberties were curtailed as leaders insisted on the need for unity and discipline in the face of disaster. In some regions, this prompted a slide into authoritarianism, with emergency powers endlessly extended. Elsewhere, governments outright collapsed under the strain. Parts of South Asia saw their administrations disintegrate, leaving a vacuum quickly filled by local strongmen or extremist groups promising food in exchange for loyalty. In Africa, some nations fractured along ethnic or regional lines when central authorities could no longer provide relief. The world map began to blur as old alliances faltered and new, desperate pacts were forged, some based on the trade of remaining resources, others formed for mutual defense against aggressive neighbors. It was a scenario that scholars of international relations had previously theorized only in apocalyptic fiction, the breakdown of the global order amid a fight for basic survival. As one analyst grimly put it, global society was unlikely to survive in any form we would recognize. As the months turned to a year, the death toll from the eruption's aftermath climbed into the tens of millions, then hundreds of millions worldwide. Starvation was the biggest killer. Disease soon followed in the wake of malnutrition and societal breakdown. Cholera spread through refugee camps, and influenza swept across populations weakened by hunger and cold. It was as if the eruption had pushed humanity to the brink, and now all four horsemen of the apocalypse were riding: plague, war, famine, and death. Some whispered that perhaps we were witnessing the beginning of human extinction. Indeed, scientists had long debated whether a supereruption could become an extinction-level event for humans. The consensus had been that while it would be catastrophic, humanity would likely survive. After all, not everyone on Earth would inhale the ash or starve at once. But the experts may have underestimated how fragile our interconnected civilization truly was. This disaster was not just a volcanic eruption, it was a cascade of crises feeding into one another. Could humanity truly bounce back? We remembered the prehistoric Toba supereruption, approximately 74,000 years ago, which some scientists believe nearly wiped out the human species, possibly reducing our ancestors to only a few thousand scattered survivors in a global volcanic winter. That was a time when humans lived in isolated bands, able to seek refuge in pockets of livable climate. Today, we are billions, but also frighteningly dependent on a complex and delicate system that had now collapsed. If the food shortages and conflicts continued for several more years, the very fabric of civilization might not recover. It was conceivable that large parts of humanity would perish, and only scattered, resilient communities in the least affected areas might endure. A grim echo of the Toba theory, but in the modern age of nuclear weapons and nation-states. The Yellowstone supereruption proved that nature could, in fact, bring our global society to its knees, and even threaten our species' survival. I write this as a humbled narrator of these events, with memories of ash and fear still vivid in my mind. I recall a moment, sometime in the second year after the eruption, when I stepped outside at noon. The ash had long settled by then, leaving a dirty scar across the world, and the sky was finally beginning to clear. Thin sunlight filtered through where once there had been only haze. Around me, a few green shoots were poking through the ashen soil, the first brave signs of nature's recovery. I fell to my knees and wept at the sight of those tiny plants. We had survived. Not all of us, not without immense loss, but a remnant of humanity persisted. The Yellowstone supereruption changed the world forever. The United States was shattered, the global climate wrecked, and human society pushed to the edge of oblivion. The consequences will echo for generations, a stark reminder of how fragile our civilization truly is in the face of Earth's immense power. As a survivor, I carry both the haunting memory of the darkness and a fragile hope that we who remain will learn to cherish the light of day, knowing how easily it can be snuffed out. The world we knew ended under ash and shadow, and from those ashes, we must build anew if we can.